First of all, once again, on behalf of the National Park Service, let me welcome you to Gettysburg National Military Park and our winter lecture series. My name is Ranger Karlton Smith, and today we're going to be talking about Mary Surratt. Before I actually get into the program, I would like to remind you that next Saturday, January 21st, Tom Holbrook's going to be speaking on If These Things Could Talk, the new acquisitions to the museum collection. And on January 22nd, we have a guest speaker here. Tracy Evans from Monocacy National Battlefield is going to be talking about the Battle of Monocacy, the fight that saved Washington, D.C. And in fact, one of the people who shows up in the story played a big role in the Battle of Monocacy. See if you folks can spot him in here someplace. But the main question here is Mary Surratt, is she guilty or not guilty of the charges of conspiracy against her? And I should preface this by saying I'm a park ranger, not a lawyer. Okay, so you had to bear that in mind as we go through this. But Mary Elizabeth Jenkins was born in 1823. She was born on the family tobacco plantation near Waterloo in Howard County, Maryland. Her father died when she was about 3 years old. She married John Harrison Surratt in August of 1840, when she was 17 and he was 27. And John Surratt has a rather colorful background. Apparently he was orphaned at a young age and then taken on as a ward by a different family. He also had at least one child born out of wedlock prior to marrying Mary Jenkins. His guardians, though, left him part of a farm, part of the family farm in 1845. And then after both of them died in 1845, John inherited the entire farm at that point. The farmhouse burned down, though, in 1851. One of the rumors was a disgruntled slave had set fire to the building. But it started in the 1850s that John himself starts to drink a little heavily. He fails to pay some debts, and reportedly his temper was becoming more violent. By 1853, though, John had purchased 200 acres of land and had built a tavern and later an inn at a major crossroads in Prince George's County, Maryland. He's residing there with his wife Mary and their 3 children. Isaac, born in 1841, Elizabeth Susanna, known as Anna, born in 1843, and John Jr., born in 1844. The property later includes a farm, a grist mill, and a general store. And by 1854, the area is known as Surrattsville, Maryland. And John Sr. is going to be chosen, this is going to be chosen as a local polling place, and John Surratt's appointed the local postmaster in 1854. But he's still having alcohol problems, he's got gambling debts, and more responsibility now rests on Mary during the 1850s. But on December 6, 1853, John was able to purchase property at what was then designated as 541 H Street in Northwest Washington, using the proceeds from the sale of the family's farm. The house itself was built in 1843 as a single-family dwelling, and John now will rent this property out in D.C. Because of the Civil War breaking out in April of 1861, on August 16, 1861, President Lincoln will issue a proclamation, part of which states that all commercial intercourse between the same, and he's talking about the states in rebellion, and the inhabitants thereof, is unlawful and will remain unlawful until such insurrections have ceased or has been suppressed. In other words, no more male connection between the United States and the Confederacy. But this leads to an illicit courier system going through southern Maryland, along what some people have termed the secret line. Runs out of D.C., goes through Prince George's County and into Charles County, Maryland. This wasn't a line as such, but it is an operation. And it's linked by farmhouses, homes, and taverns as safe houses. And along this secret line will be couriers of the Confederate government correspondents, espionage agents, recruits, foreign visitors, and contraband goods. Passage along this line is authorized over 2 signatures: the Confederate Chief of the Signal Corps and the Confederate Secretary of War. Surrattsville is about 14 miles south of Washington, D.C. John Surratt Jr. will later admit, "I was not more than 18 years of age, and was mostly engaged in sending information regarding the movements of the United States Army stationed in Washington and elsewhere, and carrying dispatches to the Confederate boats on the Potomac. We had a regular established line from Washington to the Potomac, and I being the only unmarried man on the route, I had most of the hard riding to do." So John Surratt, after the war, is going to readily admit he was a Confederate agent operating on this line. Now, John Surratt Sr. would die in August of 1862. Let me back up. Surratt Tavern becomes a safe house along this line. One local Presbyterian minister stated that Prince George's County is a very disloyal neighborhood. And that's easy to understand. The 1850 census, or at least according to the 1850 census, roughly half the population of both Prince George's and Charles County to the south of it were slaves. So very southern in its outlook. John Surratt Sr. dies in August of 1862, leaving the estate to Mary, but also with these debts that have to be paid. John Surratt Jr. will leave St. Charles College in Baltimore and is appointed to succeed his father as postmaster in Surrattsville on September 1st, 1862. And he's going to take a loyalty oath as required, but almost immediately starts working as a Confederate agent for this Confederate Signal Corps. He's finally arrested in November of 1863, imprisoned for a short while, and dismissed as the postmaster. Now, with nothing else to do, John's basically working full-time as a courier between Washington, Richmond, and also Canada. So he's got that route going for him. His older brother, Isaac, had left the area in March of 1861, gone to Texas, and enlisted in the 33rd Texas Cavalry. So Mary Surratt now has one son actively serving the Confederate Army and one son serving as a courier between Montreal and Richmond. Mary, in 1864, decides to rent the tavern to John Lloyd, a retired D.C. policeman, for $500 a month. The plan is to move then to the boarding house in D.C., and Anna Surratt moves to the boarding house in September of '64. Mary remains at the tavern until December to help Lloyd with the transition. The Surratt boarding house itself has what's termed an English basement, what we might call the first floor. And in that floor will be used as a kitchen and dining rooms. On the second floor There's a front and back parlor. The one in the rear being used as Mary's bedroom. The third floor had 2 small rooms in front and a large one in the rear. On the third floor in the attic were 2 large bedrooms and 1 small room in the back. The first boarder is Honoria Fitzpatrick, age 17. She moves in on October 6. On November 1st, 1864, Louis J. Weichman, a friend of John Surratt's from college, and a clerk in the office of General Hoffman, Commissary General of Prisoners, has a room on the 3rd floor. Honoria, or Nora, shares a room with Anna and Mary. The Holland family moved in around February 7, 1865, and a few additional acquaintances to complete the long-term boarders. When John's in town, from whatever he's doing, he shares a room with Weichman. Some historians have questioned this move, at least at this time. They've argued that in the long term, this does make good economic sense. But in the short term, Mary has to take out a loan to effect not just her physical move from the tavern to town, she also now has to furnish a 10-room townhouse as a boarding house. And some suspect she's making this move to help facilitate John's role as a Confederate courier. He now has a place in town where he can stay. Coming onto the scene now is an American actor, John Wilkes Booth. And Booth now is in the process of organizing what today is termed an action team for the purpose of trying to kidnap President Lincoln. On or about January 15th, 1865, John Wilkes Booth will ask his acquaintance, Dr. Samuel Mudd, who knew the Surratt family, to accompany him to the boarding house for the purpose of meeting John Surratt. While they're walking there, they encountered Surratt and Louis Weichman on the street. And then they all 4 spend the evening together socializing at Booth's room at the National Hotel and the lobby of the Pennsylvania House. Now, Weichman will later state that on occasions there, Booth will pull Surratt off to the side and have a private conversation with him about what Weichman doesn't know. But this is what Weichman is saying. Also, John Surratt would take a job with the Adams Express Company starting on December 30th, 1864, but he leaves it on January 13th, 1865. He does pick up his wages for 2 days, but never comes back for the rest of it, which everybody thought was a little strange. Booth now, though, becomes a frequent visitor to the boarding house, meeting with both John and Mary, sometimes together, sometimes separately. Over the rest of the winter of 1865, George Atzerodt, Lewis Powell, and David Harold all stayed at the boarding house on at least one occasion. George Atzerodt joined Booth as a regular visitor, and these 3 men, along with John Surratt, are part of Booth's action team to kidnap the president. But Booth is not the only game in town, so to speak. According to a confession made by George Atzerodt on May 2nd, 1865, quote, Booth said he had met a party in New York who would get the president certain. They were going to mine the end of the president's house near the War Department. They knew an entrance to accomplish it through. These were understood to be projects. Booth said if he did not get him, the president, quick, the New York crowd would. So in other words, if Booth can't kidnap the president, this New York group was planning to blow up the White House and get them that way. Now, that's a contingency plan in case the kidnapping doesn't work. On March 15th, 1865, John Surratt and Lewis Powell attend a play at Ford's Theater and sit in the presidential box, which had been arranged for them by John Wilkes Booth. As a cover for this, they accompany Honoria Fitzpatrick, who's 17 years old, who boarded the Surratt house, and also Mary Apollonia Dean, who was 10 years old, and another boarder at the time at the house. On March 17th, Booth learns that Lincoln is to attend a play at Campbell's Hospital just outside of town. And he figures that's a good time to attempt the kidnapping. On March 17th, Surratt, Harold, and Atzerodt would deliver 2 carbines, 2 double-barreled shotguns, a dirk, a sword, ammunition, 20 feet of rope, and a monkey wrench to John Lloyd at the tavern. And Surratt tells Lloyd to hide them in an unfinished attic space. In fact, Surratt had to tell Lloyd where it was because Lloyd didn't even know the thing existed. As it turns out, the president doesn't attend the play. But on April 2nd, Richmond falls to the Yankees. And on April 9th, Lee surrenders to Grant at Appomattox. In Booth's mind, at least now, the kidnapping plan turns into one of assassination. On April 10th, Mary's going to ask Louis Weichman to accompany her on a trip to Prince George's County to collect a debt. While passing through Uniontown, they encounter John Lloyd. Mary at that point asked Lloyd about the shooting irons and suggested they would be needed soon. On April 14th, Mary, again accompanied by Weichman, delivers a set of field glasses given to her that morning by Booth to John Lloyd, and again saying the shooting irons were going to be called for that night. They arrived back at the boarding house about 8:30 p.m. At about 9 o'clock, Booth shows up at the boarding house and has a private talk with Mary, then leaves for Ford's Theater. And at 10:15, April 14th, Booth will assassinate President Lincoln. 4 hours later, at 2 a.m. of April 15th, the Metropolitan Police come to the house looking for John Surratt and question Mary about his location. According to Louis Weichman, when the detectives came at 3 o'clock the next morning, I rapped at her Mary Surratt's door for permission to let them in. For God's sake, let them come in. I expected the house to be searched, said she. After breakfast on April 15th, Louis Weichman, along with John Hollowan, whose family was staying at the Surratt house, go to the Metropolitan Police headquarters and give testimony on what they know. Weichman stated, quote, I told Officer McDivitt about Payne and what I knew of Surratt, Atzerodt, and Harold. No threats were made in case I did not divulge what I knew, and no offers of inducement if I did. His statements were considered credible enough that both Weichman and Hollowan are now asked to escort Metropolitan Police officers to Canada in the hopes of catching John Surratt. So that's how good they think the testimony is. While all that's going on, Colonel Henry W. Wells, the Provost Marshal for the District of Columbia, is sending Major Henry W. Smith to the boarding house, who arrives at 11 p.m. on April 16th. According to Major Smith, no inquiry was made as to the cause of the arrest, and that she, Mary, expressed no surprise or feeling at all. And they're getting ready to transport the occupants of the house to General Christopher C. Argus' headquarters. General Argus is in command of the Department of Washington, attached to the Middle Military District. And that has some significance a little bit later on. While that's going on, Colonel Henry Steele Oakart, a special government investigator, is sending his own man, Lieutenant Colonel R.C. Morgan, to the house. So when he shows up, Major Smith is already there. And they start to arrange transportation for the 4 occupants of the house: Mary Surratt, Anna Surratt, Honoria Fitzpatrick, and Olivia Jenkins, Mrs. Surratt's niece. They're the only 4 occupants in the house. Remember, Louis Weichman and John Holloman in Montreal with the police. And apparently the Holloman family has moved out by this time. But now, as they're waiting for the carriage to come and everything else, about 11:30 that p.m., who shows up at the door but Lewis Powell, carrying a pickaxe? Now, you have to keep in mind, Lewis Powell is about 6'2" and a very muscular guy. You're not talking about some shrimp here. He's a very formidable presence. The story he gives now is that he had been hired by Mrs. Surratt to dig a gutter. And the reason he's showing up at 11:30 at night is to double check with her to see what time she wanted him to start in the morning. Now, the police are already suspicious of that, but they also note that some of the clothes he's wearing doesn't fit what they would describe as a working class individual. So one of the things they do is take the pick away from him. First of all, he's in the hallway and they call Mrs. Surratt out to identify him. Now, Lewis Payne, he's in the hallway underneath a gas jet that's been turned on full. Mrs. Surratt is probably about 3 or 4 feet from him. And she declares openly she's never seen this guy before, has no idea who he is. They later in the trial tried to bring up the fact that Mary Surratt's eyesight was failing her, that she could no longer thread a needle, and she didn't read at night because there wasn't enough light for her to focus on. But the police aren't buying any of this. So Powell, along with the women, are arrested. Powell doesn't put up any resistance. He goes along very peacefully. They then conduct a search of the house. And the only really incriminating things they find are a pair of spurs, a bullet mold, a composite photograph of Confederate leaders, and a carte de vista decorated with Confederate flags and the inscriptions, "Thus will it ever be with tyrants, Virginia the mighty, and Sic semper tyrannis." As it turns out, John Surratt had left Washington for Richmond on March 25th. He arrived in Richmond on March 29th and reported to Judah Benjamin, the Confederate Secretary of War. Benjamin now sends him with dispatches to Canada. He leaves Washington on April 4th and arrives in Montreal by April 6th. He is then sent by those Confederate agents to Elmira, New York, when he arrives on April 13th. The reason for John going to Elmira is they wanted him to kind of case the prison up there for the possibility of releasing Confederate prisoners. John hears about the assassination attempt, and he decides disgrace is the better part of valor, so he heads back to Canada and arrives in Montreal by April 18th. Mary's going to be interrogated by Colonel Wills. And of course, Colonel Wills, being a 19th century man, thought he could browbeat Mary into telling him what he wanted. Mary's a lot tougher than that. And she's not telling Colonel Wills anything he doesn't already know. But as a result, Mary's going to be imprisoned in Old Capitol Prison in Washington, D.C., where the U.S. Supreme Court building now stands. Also being thrown in here is Louis Weichmann. He at first is considered part of the conspiracy. They're not quite sure how he fits. So he's going to be spending some time in there. Once they get all this straightened out, Mary, along with 7 other defendants, are going to be moved to the old Arsenal Penitentiary, located now on the grounds of Fort Leslie J. McNair. And to give you kind of a heads up, only this portion right here, that building, that's the only thing left of this whole compound. I'm going to talk about that building before too long here. And then we sort of come to our first Gettysburg connection with this whole thing. Major General Winfield Scott Hancock is the commander of the Middle Military Division. He's been commanding that since February 27, 1865. And on April 22nd, Hancock will move his headquarters from Winchester, Virginia, to Washington, D.C. On May 1st, President Andrew Johnson, on the advice of the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, decides to order a military commission to try the conspirators. He does this against the advice of the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Wills, and the Secretary of the Treasury, Hugh McCulloch. On the same day, May 1st, Brevet Major General John F. Hartranft is appointed as Special Provost Marshal General for the purpose of said trial and attendance upon commission and the execution of its mandates. In other words, General Hartranft, a native Pennsylvanian, now is in charge of the prison and will execute whatever dictates the commission has for him to do. The military commission consists of 9 military officers. Starting from the left, over here, is Lieutenant Colonel David R. Clendenin, officially assigned to the 8th Illinois Cavalry, but was not present here at Gettysburg. Brevet Colonel C.H. Tompkins, Brigadier General T.M. Harris, Brigadier General Albion P. Howe, who commanded the 2nd Division of the 6th Corps here at Gettysburg, Brevet Brigadier General James A. Eking, Major General Lew Wallace, that's our Monocacy connection, Major General David Hunter, Brevet Major General August V. Kotz, Brigadier General Robert S. Foster. The Honorable John A. Bingham, right here, is a special judge advocate. Colonel Henry O. Burnett is also a special judge advocate, and Brigadier General Joseph Holt is the judge advocate. Now, the commission will establish its own rules of procedure. Today, you hear one of the criticisms against the commission is that the defendants were not allowed to testify in their own behalf. And today, that sounds pretty terrible. But in terms of the 19th century, that was standard courtroom procedure. Only one state allowed the defendants to testify in their own behalf, and that was the state of Maine, and they don't approve that until 1864. It was considered, defendants were considered incompetent to testify on their own behalf. First of all, because they might further incriminate themselves, or they might perjure themselves on the stand. So that was the reason behind not allowing defendants to testify on their own behalf. Major General David Hunter would be the president of the commission. Hunter was born in 1802, graduated from West Point in 1822, resigned his commission in 1836, then returned to the Army in 1842 in the Paymaster's Corps with the rank of Major. While commander of the Department of the South, on April 12th of 1862, he ordered all slaves in and around Fort Pulaski, Georgia, to be confiscated and declared free. In action, President Lincoln had to walk back because he wasn't quite ready for it. During Hunter's Shenandoah Valley campaign in June of 1864, he's going to burn the buildings of the Virginia Military Institute. He always presided over the court-martial of Major General Fitzjohn Porter, a court that people said was organized to convict. If you want to know more about the Fitzjohn Porter court-martial, come here on February 11th, and that's the topic Matt Atkinson is going to talk about. So you get a little heads up there. The judge advocate is Joseph Holt. He was born in 1807. Among other things, he had served as Commissioner of Patents, Postmaster General in 1859, and Interim Secretary of War. He had been appointed the judge advocate with the rank of Colonel in September of 1862, and appointed Brigadier General on June 22, 1864. It was his job to implement the administration's policy of keeping civilians in jail without recourse to the writ of habeas corpus. And he also oversaw military commissions. He's also going to be involved in the trials of Clement L. Vallandigham and Captain Henry Wirtz. If you want to know a little bit more about Henry Wirtz, come back here on March 4th. Philip, I think that's it. Philip's wife, Caitlin, is going to be giving you a talk on the trial of Henry Wirtz. Okay? So what exactly is Mary and these 7 guys charged with? Well, the basic charge is conspiracy. So how is this actually going to read? So here's where you're going to have to bear with me a little bit with the legalese. Charge 1. There's only one charge. For maliciously, unlawfully, and traitorously, and in aid of the existing armed rebellion against the United States of America, on or before the 6th day of March, AD 1865, and on divers other days and times between that date and the 15th day of April, AD 1865, combining, confederating, and conspiring together to kill and murder within the military department of Washington and within the fortified and entrenched lines thereof, Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, William H. Seward, and Ulysses S. Grant, in pursuance of and in prosecuting said malicious, unlawful, and traitorous conspiracy aforesaid, and in aid of said rebellion afterward, to wit, on the 14th day of April, AD 1865, within the military department of Washington aforesaid, and within the fortified and entrenched lines of said military department, maliciously, unlawfully, and traitorously murdering the said Abraham Lincoln. That's the charge. The specification against Mary is going to read, and in further prosecution of said conspiracy, Mary E. Surratt did, at Washington City, and within the military department and military lines aforesaid, on or before the 6th day of March, AD 1865, and on divers other days and times between that day and the 20th day of April, AD 1865, receive and attain, harbor and conceal, aid and assist the said John Wilkes Booth and their Confederates with the knowledge of the murderous and traitorous conspiracy aforesaid, and with intent to aid, abet, and assist them in the execution thereof, and in escaping from justice after the murder of the said Abraham Lincoln, as aforesaid. So basically, Mary's being charged with having knowledge of this plan to kill the president and helping Booth carry it out and escape. That's what all 8 conspirators are charged with. The only major difference is when you get to Lewis Powell. And Lewis Powell is now specifically also charged with trying to murder William Henry Seward, the Secretary of State. That's the only major change in all 8 articles against the conspirators. The meeting of the commission would take place in what's now referred to as the Old Officers' Barracks, Building 20, Grant Hall at Fort McNair. That one section I highlighted, the old federal penitentiary, this is what's left of it. But that just happens to be the building on the 3rd floor where the commission is going to meet. The meeting takes place, first meeting takes place on May 9th. The prisoners are given till 10 a.m. the next day, roughly 24 hours, to secure counsel. And you might wonder who's going to defend the conspirators of Abraham Lincoln. Well, some very top-notch lawyers come in to help with some of the defense, including, probably the most prestigious, Reverend Johnson of Maryland. Now, Johnson was born in 1796. He had served in the Maryland Senate, a United States Senator, U.S. Attorney General, he actually represented the slave owner in Dred Scott versus Sandford in 1857, was a Maryland delegate to the Peace Conference in 1861, and had served in the Maryland House of Delegates. He also represented, another strange connection here, he also represented Major General Fitzjohn Porter at the court-martial headed by David Hunter. So Reverend Johnson is well aware of how David Hunter operates a court. And even though he is representing Mary Surratt, his main focus here is to challenge the constitutionality of military tribunals to try civilians. Part of his argument went that a tribunal like this has no jurisdiction over other than military offenses is believed to be self-evident. That offenses defined and punished by the civil law and whose trial is provided for by the same law are not subjects of military jurisdiction is, of course, true. Now, keep in mind, it's not until after November 1963 that shooting a president is a federal offense. Prior to that, they were all state offenses. So if Lee Harvey Oswald had gone to trial, it would have been before the regular courts meeting in Dallas and not a federal court. Okay? Also joining Reverend Johnson for the defense of Mary Surratt are 2 young attorneys on his firm, John W. Clampett, and this is a later picture of Clampett, and Frederick Aiken. Of course, U.S. Attorney General James Speed is asked to give his opinion on the constitutionality of the tribunal, the commission. And after going through about 5 or 6 pages of reasoning, this is what Speed's going to come up with. My conclusion, therefore, is that if the persons who are charged with the assassination of the president committed the deed as public enemies, as I believe they did, and whether they did or not is a question to be decided by the tribunal before which they are tried, they not only can but ought to be tried before a military tribunal. If the persons charged have offended against the laws of war, it would be as palpably wrong for the military to hand them over to civil courts as it would be wrong in a civil court to convict a man of murder who had, in time of war, killed another in battle. In other words, the proper authority to decide, first of all, if the conspirators are public enemies is the military tribunal. So if the military tribunal decides that, then naturally they're the ones who can try it. So the military tribunal is basically being asked to decide on its own merits if it's constitutional or not. You kind of guess how a military tribunal is going to decide on that one. But James Speed, as an addendum, is going to cite Francis Lieber. Now, Francis Lieber was a well-known authority on both international law and the laws of war. In fact, on April 21st of 1863, under Lieber's guidance, the government is going to issue General Order 100, also known as Instructions for the Government of Armies of the United States in the Field, what we today might call rules of engagement. Section 9, paragraph 148 covers assassination. And this is what Lieber wrote. The law of war does not allow proclaiming either an individual belonging to the hostile army or a civilian or a subject of the hostile government an outlaw who may be slain without trial by any captor, any more than the modern law of peace allows such international outlawry. On the contrary, it abhors such outrages. The sternest retaliation should follow the murder committed in consequence of such proclamation, made by whatever authority. Civilized nations look with horror upon offers of rewards for the assassination of enemies as relapses into barbarism. So in other words, the head of one government can't put out a wanted poster on the head of the opposing government and offer reward for the assassination. That goes counter to the laws of war and international laws. The courtroom is going to be laid out like this: a table for the military commission, a witness stand, table for the reporters, tables for the counsels, and then the prisoner's dock. And take a look just at this prisoner's dock. Mary Surratt, guard. Harold, guard. Payne, guard. All the way down, there's a guard between each prisoner. So there's no presumption of confidentiality, if you will, between the prisoners and their defense. Now, the guards have been told not to listen in, but they're standing right there. So I don't know how you're going to avoid one or the other. And then there are some sketches of what the courtroom actually looked like during the trial. The two main witnesses against Mary Surratt would be Louis Weichmann and John Lloyd. Now, some claim Weichmann especially had been coerced into giving testimony, but Weichmann always denied this. We do know that Weichmann spent almost 30 days in Old Capitol Prison, and there are some who claim his story changed in those 30 days to more implicate Mary Surratt. And also, one interesting thing about the law back then, if you do testify in a conspiracy trial, you can't be charged with conspiracy yourself. So that's one of the quirks in the law back then. They'll also try to claim that Weichmann really wanted to go south and join the Confederate government. He was a secret Southerner in that sense. And they'll also try to claim that John Lloyd was drunk when Mary talked to him. Now, from what I've read in the transcript, all the people who said Lloyd was drunk also say they never knew him to be so drunk as when he was talking to Mary Surratt. So if all the time he was drunk, the drunkest just happened to be when he was with Mary Surratt. And you can imagine the prosecution blowing hose and all that. They also brought in some of Weichmann's supervisors, if you will, to testify to his good character. But Weichmann's testimony especially is still somewhat controversial. And there are some people who think the government prosecuting Mary was simply a tactic to try to bring John Surratt back from Canada. But John Surratt stays the whole time in Canada while he's up there. Now, the military commission at the end here has to go through the testimony of 366 witnesses and 4,900 pages of testimony. So it's estimated they're going to take a while to go through all this. They first meet at 10 a.m. on June 29th, and after mature consideration of the evidence, the verdicts are delivered to President Johnson, who approves of them on July 5th, 6 days later. So they went through this whole thing pretty quickly. According to the rules, 6 of the 9 members must agree to convict and the punishment. Apparently, 5 of the members of the commission had proposed to either acquit Mary of all charges or at least spare her life. And this is where things get a little murky. The most common story is at that point, Judge Advocate Holt went to Secretary of War Stanton, told him what the situation was. And Stanton told Holt, go back to the commission and tell them if they vote to convict and execute Mary, they can send in a petition for clemency, and I'll make sure President Johnson sees it. Whatever the truth of the matter, 5 members of the commission, including David Hunter. If you know anything about David Hunter, that's a big surprise. David Hunter do sign a petition for clemency for Mary Surratt. Now, President Johnson by 1873 will claim he never saw that, and the Judge Holt kept it from him. Holt's going to respond with a newspaper article citing letters from not just officials in the War Department, but at least 2 cabinet members who remembered the petition was debated at a cabinet meeting, and that the clemency was attached to all the evidence from the trial itself. So the report is Johnson had to see it, but Johnson himself always denied he ever saw it. On July 6th, General Hancock would deliver 8 sealed envelopes from the War Department to General Hartranft. Those envelopes are given to the conspirators. 4 are delivered to Lewis Powell, Mary Surratt, David Howard, and George Atzerodt, announcing not just the verdict, but also the sentence of death. And more shocking than that, they're also told the sentences are to be carried out the next day, July 7th. So they have less than 24 hours to prepare. Mary's going to be spending those last hours with her priests, at least 2 priests. Anna Surratt is there for a while. The 2 younger lawyers are there for a while. And some other members of the Surratt family come and go. Anna Surratt is going to try to see the president to try to get clemency, and she can't get in to see him. But also pleading for clemency is Mrs. Adele Cutts Douglas, the widow of Senator Stephen Douglas. She was also a niece of Rose O'Neill Greenhow, who had been convicted of spying for the Confederacy. Mrs. Douglas was also a great niece of former First Lady Dottie Madison. And Adele can remember being bounced on Mrs. Madison's knee when she was young. So you might be able to keep out Anna Surratt, and nobody's going to complain too much about it. But I'm pretty sure Mrs. Douglas got in to see the president. Can you imagine what the press might say if the president refused to see the widow of Stephen Douglas? They'd be all over it at that point. Being given the assignment as executioner is Captain Christian Rath from the 17th Michigan on the staff of General Hartranft. The construction of the galleys will begin on July 6th. By the time they're done, it's going to be 12 feet high. The platform is 20 square feet. Ratt's going to make 4 nooses, 3 with the traditional 7 twists, 1 with only 5, and that was for Mary. There's 2 reasons for that. One is Ratt, like everybody else, was convinced at the last minute Mary's going to receive clemency. It was also past midnight, and Ratt was getting tired. So that's why I only put 5 twists in the last one. The soldiers began testing the galleys about 11:25 a.m. on July 7th. By noon, the temperature was close to 100 degrees. But her lawyers aren't done yet. Aiken and Clampett would now go to Andrew Wiley, Justice of the Supreme Court in the District of Columbia, and file a writ of habeas corpus in behalf of Mary Surratt. And they do this, it's said they do this early in the morning. The writ is actually issued at 3 a.m. in the morning. So they got Judge Wiley up around midnight. It's served on General Hancock, and he is now ordered to produce Mary Surratt in court to Andrew Wiley by 10 a.m. that morning. Hancock sends an order to the prison to Hartranft to not allow any U.S. Marshal into the prison. By not allowing the Marshal in, he can't deliver the writ to General Hartranft. So General Hancock now and Attorney General Speed will go to the President. And President Johnson is going to issue an order suspending the writ in this case, and that's presented to Judge Wiley at 11:30 a.m. that morning. With the President suspending the writ, there's nothing Judge Wiley can do. So everything's now going to move forward. Alexander Gardner will get the assignment of being sort of the official photographer for the execution. And I'll give you a heads up here, some of the pictures might be considered disturbing to some people. Okay? At about 11:15, the procession will come out of the building, headed for the gallows. Mary had to be supported by 2 soldiers and a priest. She's wearing a black alpaca dress and a black veil. Captain Ratt deliberately put Mary on the right side of the 4 up here because he considered that the place of honor, and he wanted to give it to Mary. Yeah. Sometimes there's no understanding gallantry in the 19th century. Because of the heat, Mary and a lot of the VIPs up there are going beyond under umbrellas, try to shade them a little bit. Although what good black umbrellas are doing, I'm not sure. But now General Hartranft will read again the execution order publicly. And here we see Mary under the umbrella with her 2 priests praying for her the last minute. Once Hartranft has read the warrant, the ministers are given one final chance to pray with the condemned. Once they back off, it's now time to adjust the ropes. Binds are put around the arms, legs, and ankles of the condemned. Mary complained her bindings hurt. And one soldier reportedly said, "Well, it won't hurt for long." About 16 minutes after the prisoners enter the courtyard, everything's ready. The prisoners stand up. They move forward to the drop. The witnesses and everybody moves back. Captain Rath, who's on the ground, gives some type of signal, and the props are pulled out. Mary had just taken a step onto the drop. She hadn't actually moved far enough. And so when the drop fell, she, instead of dropping straight down, she apparently lurched forward. The rope snapped her back and probably broke her neck. A lot of people said Mary's death appeared to be the easiest. And eventually, everything's done. The bodies were allowed to hang for about 30 minutes before they were cut down. And as the prisoners were coming out, just to one side of the scaffold were the graves and the wooden boxes for the condemned. George Atzerodt was the first one to be cut down, and they just cut him down and he dropped with a thud. After that, the soldiers were reprimanded and the bodies were brought down a little bit easier. When Mary's was cut down, she was the last one, about 1:58 p.m. When her body was cut down, her head fell forward, and a soldier stated, "She makes a good bow," and was rebuked by an officer for his poor use of humor. I was talking to one of our volunteers here before the show started. And actually, let me preface that. Once everything's over, Captain Rath is going to start to cut up the rope into 1 foot lengths and start to saw up the platform to sell for souvenirs. Okay? Get back to our one volunteering here. He and his wife are actually part of a Civil War dance troupe. And another member of the troupe happens to be a descendant of General Hartranft. And one of the more bizarre things he has from the general are 4 1 foot length of rope from each of the 4 nooses up here. The boarding house that night, is going to be attacked by a mob stripping of souvenirs until stopped by the police. As Surratt was spent 4 years asking for her mother's remains. In 1867, the government decided to tear down a portion of the Washington Arsenal where the graves were located. The coffins were disinterred on October 1st, 1867, and reinterred in vaults in Warehouse Number 1 at the Arsenal. Finally, on February 8th, 1869, Mary's body was returned to the Surratt family. She was buried the next day, February 9th, 1869, in Mount Olivet Cemetery, Washington, under simply a stone that reads, Mrs. Surratt. John himself is going to be sheltered by priests in St. Laborie, Canada. He then flees to Liverpool, England, serves as a papal guard in Rome, and is finally arrested on November 23rd, 1866, in Alexandria, Egypt, and brought home on the USS Swatar, which comes in on February 19th, 1867. John is charged as an accomplice to murder and tried in civilian court on June 10th, 1867, which ends in a mistrial. The government then indicts him for treason in 1868, but that indictment is rejected because the conspiracy charge had passed the 2-year statute of limitations. The government tried for a second indictment, and that was dismissed by the grand jury, citing the first dismissal for the same reason. So John now is clear. He can't be tried for anything at this point, so he decides to go on a lecture tour, talking about his activities as a Confederate courier and sort of downplaying his role in the conspiracy. Now, in this, he doesn't have much to say about his old friend Louis Weichmann. In fact, what he did say was this: I have very little to say of Louis J. Weichmann, but I do pronounce him as a base-born perjurer, a murderer of the meanest hue. Give me a man who can strike his victim dead, but save me from a man who, through perjury, will cause the death of an innocent person. Double murderer. Hell possesses no worse fiend than a character of that kind. For his part, Louis Weichmann got a job at the Philadelphia Customs House, supposedly due to the influence of Edwin Stanton. He's there off and on, depending on which party's in power, until 1885, where he moves to Anderson, Indiana. One brother was a Catholic priest, and two sisters had already settled there. And White was going to open a business school. He died on June 5th, 1902, after swearing out another affidavit reaffirming his testimony in the conspiracy trial. So he's basically signing a deathbed confession. The U.S. Army, in its infinite wisdom, not only preserved that section of the building that the conspiracy was in, they've also restored the room on the third floor to the way it looked during the conspiracy trial. And this, I understand, is open once a quarter. So check on the Fort McNair website, and you can probably find out when it's open again. The site of the gallows, ironically, is now occupied by the officers' tennis court at Fort McNair. The Surratt Tavern was sold at auction in 1869. It is now 9118 Brandywine Road, Clinton, Maryland, and operated by the Surratt Society. The Surrattsville later changed its name to Clinton to avoid association with the Surratt family. But I understand that the high school and middle school there are still named Surrattsville. So the name is still around. The boarding house itself was sold on June 26, 1866, to help pay off remaining debts. It's gone through various owners over the years. The outside especially has changed configuration somewhat. It is now designated as 604 H Street, Northwest Washington, in Chinatown, and is, you guessed, the Walk and Roll restaurant. But in 1968, this was designated as a DC landmark. In 1982, it was part of the Downtown Historic District, and it does have a plaque, or it is on the National Register of Historic Places. John Surratt himself moved to Baltimore, married Mary Victorine Hunter in 1872, and had 7 children before his death in 1916. Mary Surratt has the distinction, if you will, as being the first woman hanged by the federal government. Was she completely innocent? Or did she, as President Johnson said, kept the nest that hatched the egg? You want a personal opinion? I think Mary is guilty of something. I find it hard to believe that a woman who has a son in the Confederate Army, another one who's a Confederate courier that she knows is a Confederate courier, and all these strange guys coming in and out of the house, that something's not going on, especially when she's asked by John Wilkes Booth to at least take these field glasses out to John Lloyd at Surratt's Tavern. Does it come up to the grade of punishment of being executed? Probably not. But Mary, as a former friend of mine here used to say, is probably guilty up to her eyeballs. And John Surratt is probably guilty up to the top of his head. The debate over Mary Surratt's guilt or innocence still goes on. And there are those who say she is completely guilty, and those who say she's being railroaded by the government for one reason. And that's to entice John Surratt to come back from Canada and give himself up. If that's what the government was thinking, it's not going to work.